Well, good afternoon, everyone. Really glad that you're joining us. I want to make sure that our presenter, Chris Meinzer, has all the time that we've allotted as much. We got about an hour with Chris. So we want to get right to it. But I just want him to know that this group is made up of a combination of North Park faculty and staff at the seminary, some of the board of trustees who relate to the seminary particularly, and also some of our senior cabinet, including our president. She's on, if you could wave quick, Mary Surridge, there's a president of the university.
Chris,
So
welcome to North Park virtually.
Thank you.
I hyped you up, Chris, because we love your presentations at ATS.
Oh, wow.
So,
Thank you, Dennis.
But anyway, I just want you to be able to have as much time as you can. So I'm going to turn it over to you like right now. My quick word of prayer is, Lord, please be with Chris and empower him as he shares these important things with us. And may we have ears to hear in the name of our Lord Jesus. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, Dennis. Thank you so much. Thank you for working with me in this space. So friends, I'm going to jump right in and share my screen. Periodically, I might look to my right or my left just because I want to make sure that I'm looking at your faces also. Please forgive me. And if you have any questions at any time, please jump in, raise your hand, whatever makes sense for you. What I want you to know is I'm kind of sharing with you a framework that I've called Mission, Models, and Money. And I'm going to give a couple of frameworks, but also look very specifically at North Park in terms of what North Park is in relation to the broader landscape of North American theological education. And really my components here are based upon kind of three sections. We're going to look at assessing the moment, kind of what's a good framework to use when you're trying to assess the moment. The second is actually understanding the ecosystem. And we're going to look at some data points that I think really give you a good sense of where North Park is within ATS theological education. And then we're going to talk about pursuing your core why. So those are the three sections: assessing the moment, understanding the ecosystem, and pursuing your core why. I'm going to go a little faster than I normally would because I've unfortunately limited myself to an hour because of my own time constraints, but this will maybe whet your appetite for some additional conversations. So first of all, I want you to know when we're thinking about kind of solving for sustainability, the sustainability of a school's mission, we need to really take a look at the moment. And when we think about theological education, from my perspective, theological schools kind of sit in that crossroads of higher education and the church. And so if we think about that kind of framing, we understand that there are challenges. And those challenges, from my perspective, require really an honest assessment of where we are. Because I think the way forward will be impacted by our evaluation of the times. Okay, so that's my premise. The way that we think about where we need to go is going to be impacted by how we actually evaluate the time. So let me share a framework before we jump into some data. Back in March of 2020, there was an article written. It was called "Leading Beyond the Blizzard: Why Every Organization is Now a Startup." This article, as you can see, was written right at the time when things were really kicking up in terms of the pandemic. And the authors were kind of pressing organizations to think about what does this mean? What does the pandemic itself mean? And I actually think the framework that they gave us can be useful and instructive in our own way of assessing the times. And let me kind of unpack that just for a minute. So first of all, they say we're not going back to normal. And I actually think that was the case for us, right? We weren't going back to normal. The question was whether or not we were sitting in a blizzard, a time of blizzard, a time of a winter, or an ice age. In this case, they were talking about a 12 to 18 month ice age. And they were thinking about what it means in terms of of the pandemic, but I think this is useful for us. For those of you who are in Chicago, because I'm actually located in Pittsburgh, this framing I think actually makes sense to us. So if we think about a blizzard, if our assessment of the times is that we're sitting in a blizzard, what I know about a blizzard is that oftentimes, I think the Sierra Nevadas, think about it right now, I think they're getting like 8 to 12 feet of snow, right? Our ability to do anything about that is pretty minimal. There's not a lot that we could do in that space. The effort that would be required would be for us to take actually extraordinary effort, and it probably would be unsustainable. So the best approach for us to take at that point is basically just to wait it out. If we're assessing the times and we think we're in a blizzard, probably the best thing for us to do would be just to wait it out. But if we're actually in a winter, okay, let's think about that for a second. If we're in a winter, then what we know is we're coming up to a season. There's a time period. In Pittsburgh, although it's about 72 degrees today in Pittsburgh, I don't know what it's like where you are, but normally winter lasts from October to March, right? There's a longer period of time. What we know we need to do is we need to make some adjustments, but we always have the promised return to spring. Right? We need to make some adjustments. We do some planning, but ultimately we know things are going to go back to the way they were. The third option here is an ice age. The authors were saying, are we in a blizzard? Are we in a winter? Or are we in an ice age? I think this is instructive because, as we know, an ice age can last many seasons, right? Many periods. In some ways, it reshapes our reality and our existence. It requires us, even if we don't want to, it requires us to rethink what we're actually experiencing. And we know that if we don't make some adjustments, it might, in fact, impact our survival. So the actions that we need to take are long-term, thoughtful, and adaptive. Right? So you see blizzard, wait it out, winters, some technical changes, an ice age, maybe some long-term adaptation. So as we're assessing the times, as you're thinking about where you are, I want to give you this starting framework so that you think about when you're in conversations and you're thinking, oh, I'm sorry, is this a blizzard? Is this a winter? Or is this an ice age? Because if you see, like, think about it, are theological schools in a blizzard, winter, or ice age? Is the church, the places where our students are going to go, the places that we're sending our graduates in an ice age, a winter, or a blizzard? Is theological education itself in a winter, blizzard, or an ice age? I think this will have impact on us. So if we think whatever we're assessing, if we're assessing the moment, if we think it's a blizzard, we know it's going to be a rough period of time, but our best approach is just to wait it out, take incremental action, take incremental steps, but because we know basically the only thing we can do is wait it out. If it's a winter, there might be a little bit more actions we need to take, right? There might be some sustained period of uncomfortableness, but still, after a period of time, we have the promise of spring. No, we don't need to make any kind of major alterations. But if we're truly in an ice age, if something has reshaped us, and I'm going to look at data that says it's not just the pandemic that's reshaping who we are. There's a lot of things that are reshaping who we are and what we're doing. If it's really an ice age, we can try to deny it, but we likely won't be able to outlast it. Okay. So some major adaptation is required for both surviving and thriving. Okay. So that makes sense, right? When you're in these conversations, I'd really encourage you to say, are we treating this like a blizzard moment? Are we treating this like a winter moment? Are we treating this like an ice age moment? I think that framework can be really instructive, because I think my perspective, having worked now at ATS for more than 25 years, having worked with theological schools for a really long time, I think that sometimes our actions are not commensurate with our reality. We have to really think about, what are we dealing with here? So that's the first framework when we're thinking about assessing the times. So the second part then is, let's talk a little bit about understanding our ecosystem. In order for us, we first need to be thinking as we go through this, is this a blizzard, a winter, or an ice age? Are we understanding that one way or another? And I think we have to understand the broader ecosystem in which we do our work as North Park, so that we can lead honestly, creatively, and communally. Okay. So from a North Park perspective, then let's take a look at just some data. On the left-hand side, we have all ATS schools over the last 20 years. On the right-hand side, which I think is quite instructive, would be the same set ATS schools for the last 20 years. One of the things that I want you to notice, you may be seeing red lines. That's not me. I think that's somebody else writing those red lines. But if you see how the trajectory of the same set schools is occurring, what I want you to notice is that overall in ATS schools, the number of degree-seeking students over the last 20 years is actually pretty flat. That could surprise many folks when we talk about what's happening with enrollment across ATS schools. Normally, or very often, the conversation is more about, hey, things are not going so well. But in fact, across ATS, it's important to acknowledge or notice that the number of degree-seeking students is fairly flat. What I need you to understand, though, is how the underlying pieces are changing. So with the Master of Divinity, which should be the dark blue, over the last 20 years or so, the enrollment in the MDiv is down by 33%. So overall, across 280 ATS schools, the number of MDiv students is down by a third. The number of MA students, which is the lighter blue, is actually up by 25%. So the number of MA students is down slightly, but it's because of the growth of the MA that is really where we are. So it's important to see the pieces underneath. The advanced professional, which for ATS schools is mostly the doctor of ministry, is up by 10%. And then advanced academic, which is the PhD, THD for the most part, is down by 10%, okay? So thinking about broad strokes over the last 20 years, understanding the ecosystem and the currents that are helping move you along and the currents against which you are swimming, the MDiv is down by a third, MAs are up by 25%, and then overall, advanced degrees in terms of doctoral, PhD, THD, or doctor of ministry are kind of flat. One other piece there is the orange piece. That would be the other. So that's non-degree students, students that are taking classes, but not toward a particular degree, might have been certificate, is actually down by 55%. So the number of students who are dabbling, if you will, is down pretty significantly, okay? So as we get a little closer to North Park, then I want to share with you this. So we often look, we also look at data by ecclesial family: evangelical Protestant, mainline Protestant, Roman Catholic, Orthodox. these ecclesial families are also drivers of our reality. So at the top, we're looking at the same set, 87 evangelical schools. And what I want you to see is the box on the right. So we would put North Park in this category. We would see that the number of degree-seeking students in this cohort is actually up by 4%. So this is a cohort that's helping you along a bit. The 45-55% means that over this 20-year period, 45% of these schools grew, 55% declined. See that on that box also, 45 up, 55 down. What I want you to also notice is how the difference has happened, where the MDiv used to be 39% of enrollment, it's now 30%. And MAs are 27% of enrollment here versus 40% of enrollment. Compare that to what's happening in mainline schools. So mainline schools overall are down by 33%. The number of schools growing is 20%, and the number declining is 80%, right? So this ecosystem, understanding the broader ecosystem, is really important. And then Roman Catholic Orthodox down by 14%, with 30 schools growing, 30% growing, 70% declining. So in your world, as we get a little closer to North Park, what I want you to understand is that the ecosystem is actually helping you to some extent, okay? So this is actually North Park. This is enrollment in North Park over the last 20 years. And what I would normally do if we were all in a room together, I would normally pause and say, okay, let's process together what's going on with these enrollment pieces. So if there's anyone who's willing to jump in and say, raise their hand and let me know, hey, what do you see in terms of enrollment here for North Park? What are some of the trends that are similar to and different from what we've seen across ATS and perhaps even your ecclesial family? So let me stop there. What do you see? Yeah, Dennis, please.
MDiv has gone down, same as
Yeah,
other.
it's same as other, but a little steeper, right? So if you looked across all of ATS, the MDiv would be down about 33%. In this case, the MDiv at North Park has gone down by 2/3, right? So it's almost twice what it was for overall ATS. And when you look, if I just sneak back just for a second, you know, you can see the decline. I didn't calculate it here. So there actually still is a decline in the evangelical world, but it also would not be at the 65% clip. So that's a really good piece to point out. What else, Dennis?
Well, of course, the MA has gone up.
Yeah. So we have the increase in the MA, and we had some conversation. It would be important, I think, for the community, perhaps to speak to what are we seeing in 2018 that's in play here, and how do we understand? Because that's a pretty significant bump up that we hit a peak in 2021 with this additional bump, that it now looks like the peak is starting to come back down. So can we understand that together as a community?
Cheryl,
That's when we launched Ignite MA cohorts, Equip MA cohorts, and then the School of Restorative Arts MA cohorts. So that shot our MA numbers up. And then if you look at 2022 and 23, we have not had those cohorts, or they've been in much smaller numbers. And so
Love
that
it.
explains the plateau there.
Bailey, thank you. Thank you for speaking that into the room. And so then let me also kind of speak into the room here. Here's what I've actually found as I've looked at some of the data across ATS. It actually is not surprising, and maybe not surprising to you, but it bears itself out in the ATS data too. For a new program to start, when a new program starts, it's not uncommon for there to be a peak up. but it's not also uncommon within 2 to 3 years for that peak to start coming back down. So there are new programs that are started where there's a pent-up demand that's met, and then that creative space is not something that then becomes a long-term sustainable bump, right? So as we're thinking about assessing the times, how we would understand our current reality as we think about where we might be in 5 years, it would be really important for the community to discern whether or not the peak or the kind of the valley that we're looking at, like what is the right number here? With this increase in the new degree program, we shot up over 250. But if we start our way back toward where the lighter blue normally would be, it looks like it would be closer to 150, right? So as we think about our mission models and money and our economic resources, and we think about where the future could be, I'm wondering out loud with the group whether or not the number is 150 or 250. Does that make sense for everybody? You see where we're going with that, and it would be important to assess that. Thank you for that. And so MAs have shot up, increased by almost 150% in the 20-year period. MAs are now 50% of your enrollment. Whereas if we go back 20 years, the MDiv would have been close to 60% of your enrollment. It's now 20% of your enrollment, as you think about the implications of that. And so my responsibility is to share a perspective with you as an institution so that you can begin imagining, where are we being called from and where are we being called to? Like, what does that look like? Okay.
Can somebody give me a sense? What's our other degrees? I mean, I don't know if anybody has even the sense from 2010, 2011, but what's in the other degree category?
That would be certificate programs. So I think right now we have 4 to 5 active certificates that range from 8 to 15 credit hours. We had probably 10 prior to that, a larger number. We did have, I wonder if someone knows, if around 2012, 2013 is when we launched the DMin in urban ministry, but we also had 2 doctor of ministries. And then we have a number of visiting students as well. And then I think the big uptick towards the later end, like 2022, 23, is probably covenant orientation students, which is a credentialing program for the denomination.
I mean, because you have wild swings in there. That's why I was just wondering. I mean, because at any point you have a 75 student difference just in that peak alone in your other.
Yeah, and I appreciate Bailey's perspective, and Michael, I appreciate the question. It is not uncommon for ATS schools to have wild swings in the orange. That's why a lot of times I like to talk about the degree seeking students, right? So that tends to be a little bit more stable, because you can have non-degree students or a certificate that runs for a year or two, boop, 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 right? So that's kind of what's happening here. And so again, I really appreciate the question and want to not discount the orange, but really want to pay attention to the blue.
And I also think that has to do with the orientation students stepping away and coming back. So we may bring in a cohort of 25 that take one class. They may step away from a year and then come back to take a class. So they're kind of coming in and out at a pace that is difficult to track.
Well, and I also love that too, Anthony, because the most important thing that we're doing here is we're doing things for missional reasons, but we also want to be reminded of what the economic pieces that come alongside of that, like mission models and the money. And so these are wonderful moments for us in terms of our mission. but they may not be changing our economics that much, right? In terms of what that looks like, but it absolutely is an important piece for us in terms of our mission. Okay, sure. Yes, please.
I think when I look at this also in 2023, I know that there's an intentional pause to make that jump in the MAs sustainable. So for example, in the SRA and in the cohorts, and Bailey, correct me if I'm wrong, there was a pause in taking in new cohorts to make sure our infrastructure could sustain that sort of growth, and some transitions. So I really understand that dip, but also wonder, oh, now that we're stabilizing, are we in a place for that to go back up, you know?
Yeah. So excuse me, I appreciate that because you understand these data points, right? You understand what's happening and what's impacting them. And I think from my perspective, what's most important is that the community understand, that you all understand where we are in terms of that assessment, and that we keep an eye on it, right? So if that pause is intentional and we see that number tick back up, then that's something for us to pay attention to. What I do want to say is that it's not uncommon for new degree programs like this to have a peak that then tails off after a couple years. So I just want us to pay attention to that for sure. Okay. And I think if I show you a couple more data points here that I think are important. I like to share data, particularly for schools that have a long-term connection to a denomination. I think this is also something that is in play in terms of your mission. So on the left-hand side, I am showing you all Evangelical Covenant students enrolled across all of ATS. Okay, so if you look at the blue and the red, those are all Evangelical Covenant students across all ATS. So that you can see 20 years ago or so that the number of, in fact, the peak was in 2007, where there were 450 Evangelical Covenant students across ATS. In the most recent year, that number has gone from 450 to 300, okay? From 450 to 300. And what that means is a very significant part of your reality is that the market itself is declining, right? The market is going down in terms of the number of Evangelical Covenant students. What I'm also depicting on the right-hand side is while there are annual fluctuations, on average, your market share of Evangelical Covenant students is about a third. You have historically had a third. And so part of what I want you to be aware of and kind of thinking about here is that this is why ecosystem matters. Your market share has remained around a third, but the market of this pretty significant denominational cohort is going down. This is not uncommon in ATS. I grew up as a PCUSA, Presbyterian Church USA. If you looked at UMC, you looked at ELCA, you looked at a lot of denominations, the number of students who are actually identifying with those particular denominations is declining. So the old historic connections and the ecosystem does matter here, friends. And so what I want you to know is that the market has declined by 25%, while your share has stayed around 33% average. The other thing I want you to notice down here is at the bottom, of the other 100 or so schools, 100 or so students, you would find 100 in 4 other schools and another 100 in about 40 schools. So let me say that in a different way. North Park has 100 evangelical covenant students. You have 100. So you've got a third of the market share. Another 100 would be found in 4 other ATS schools. So I want you to know that there's some concentration in other ATS schools. And then the final 100 would be found in another 40 schools. Okay. So that, I think, is another factor to be considering, right? So I'm just trying to give you some pieces as you think about your ecosystem. A final piece here is on applications, right? And I think, Cheryl, this gets to kind of your question, where we are in terms of the front end of the funnel. At ATS, we look at completed applications, students accepted, and students enrolled. At the top, we are reflecting to you by degree category what your applications were over the last decade. Okay. You'll see in 2018, I think, Bailey, you've identified here, this is where the new degree kicks in. You can see where the MA is headed. In 2020, you can see where the number drops a little bit. I don't know if that's where you're starting to right size a little bit or not. 2021, it kicks back up. But also look what's happening in the MDiv. The number of applications within the MDiv is now around 10 to 15. And that number has steadily gone down from about 35 to 15, even in this last decade. So the MA is a driver. The MDiv is even going down in terms of applications. And friends, in many of these spaces, when I'm talking about applications for me, I'm thinking about interest. What is the interest that the market has for what you're offering? It's just a way of thinking about how things are looking on the front end. Okay. And I want to put that, and I want to connect that with the 2 charts on the bottom. So over the last decade, your percentage of applications acceptance has been right around 80%. It's fluctuated a bit, but it hasn't changed that much, right? So you're accepting about 80% of the students that apply. Where you've done an amazing job is on the right-hand side, when you look at the number of students that you accepted who actually enrolled. You've gone from right around 50% to now close to 90%. And that's something that I would celebrate in the system and then note a challenge, okay? Celebrate 50 to 90, but then let's also acknowledge that when we're at enrollment rates of 90%, there's not a lot of room for you to go up, right? Like people are going to choose to opt out for a number of reasons. If you're at 90%, you might be at the top. Now, there are some ATS schools that get 100%. And that has a lot to do with the way that we do applications. We're so invested in our students through the application process that there are schools that will get to 100%. But when you're sitting at 90%, you're doing a phenomenal job. And I don't know that there's a lot of room for additional growth there, right? So what has to happen are likely applications need to be driven up. You've got to get the funnel larger so that you can get those folks enrolled. Anthony.
But I would say that our acceptance to enrolled rate would probably actually drop as we start to admit more students. So filling up a little bit more at the top of the funnel, it's okay to see that acceptance to enrolled rate dip a little bit. But what we need to really do is we need more inquiries and we need more applications to help start to drive some of that enrollment growth.
That's exactly what I'm trying to push here too, right? And in fact, you need, if I could say it, you need good applications, right? You need folks that are really applying, really make sense for them to be at North Park. really makes sense for them to be participating in these degree programs that you're offering. Because you're doing a really good job of at an 80% average, you're kind of working your way through that, right? On average, ATS is at 75%. So if you just looked across ATS, the applications that are accepted on average are 75%. It's also acceptances to new enrollments is also at 75%. So you're doing a phenomenal job of getting people to enroll once you get them through the process. But you've got to then, in order for you to think about enrollments and increasing enrollments, you're likely looking at trying to get the inquiries higher, getting those good applications in your system. Good.
Chris, could I ask a question from the previous slide? And you might not be able to answer it, but I'd kind of like to get a sense of, is it all right to ask who are what are the other seminaries to which our Cub students are enrolled in if it's not North Park? I'm really kind of
Max.
curious if that's regional, like maybe it's just simply proximity, like they're just close. Like it's easier to go to a seminary that's in my backyard versus travel to Chicago. But I'm trying to get a sense of that large difference because YC, the percentage of Covenant students coming to North Park increase as the Covenant students numbers are that actually apply to any school is dropping, but we're getting a bigger percentage of that. So that was encouraging. It seems like it's a big part of our ministerium that's attending other schools.
Two things there, Max. One is, please hear correctly. Actually, your percentage is going up, but on average, it's been about a third, right? So even as those numbers are going down, you are being impacted. You are right that the difference from 2017 to 2023 is definitely a dip up, right? But on average, you're looking at that red line about a third.
Okay.
Here's the way I would, in particular, I want you to concentrate on the 100 students who are found at 4 other schools. Okay, let's talk about that for a second.
Okay.
Because of ATS's confidentiality policy, I can't share with you who those schools are, but I suspect you know who they are. You have a pretty good idea of who they are in the system. And I would say that you could likely pick out 3 of the 4. I personally was surprised by the 4th one. That's just me. But I think you could pick out the 4. And I think that very likely the way I would characterize those, I think those are students intentionally deciding where they want to go and going there. I think those are intentional decisions. When you look at that second pack, where there are 100 students at 40 other schools, I think that's where you're more likely looking at proximity. I think that's where like I'm going. So is that okay? You got me, Max, there in terms of that distinction I'm making?
Sure.
And so the other thing I want you to know in this space, because I think this is so very important to a community's discernment. When you look at the number of applications that students complete, the median, if you looked at the high to low and you look right in the middle, the median is 1. Most students actually have a pretty good idea of where they're going to go. And in fact, you have spent a good bit of time getting them through the inquiry phase so that they're like, oh, okay, yeah, now I'm going to apply. It is true that there are places where students might apply to a number, but the majority of students apply to one school. So when you're looking at that 100 to 40, those are probably proximity decisions. The 100 to 4 are probably decisions around, hey, I think this makes more sense for me in terms of where I want to go. Good question.
Chris, I had another question on this slide.
Sure.
I assume that the definition of these Covenant students, it's self-reporting, students self-report that they are part of this denomination.
Yeah, the way that it actually works, Nathan, is the schools are reporting to us what they know about the students.
And does ATS track at all if there's a change in student self-identity of denominations throughout, or is that not tracked?
There's no way for us to do
Yeah.
that. Here's what I would know though, like, it is so in our entering and graduating student questionnaire, so this is a different data source. There are shifts that occur, right? But for the most part, students go to seminaries that have a similar theological perspective to them. There are some students who will choose to go someplace different, but for the most, they're going to schools that have a similar theological perspective. What I think we also know in society right now, denominations do not mean what they once did, right? So that's also in play here. So what I think is important is we know for sure that evangelical covenant students are not your only population that you're drawing from. Your second largest denomination is actually identified as other, right? So it's the pool of students that go into a pot that's known as other.
Thank you.
Yep. So ecosystem, right? Ecosystem. This is what matters. What are the places that are actually helping you, and what is actually kind of impacting you, right? One final piece on the data in the ecosystem. Thank you for your attention. Is I always want you at the, we look on the front end, I want to look on the back end, right? Are students getting placed, and are they graduating on time? We're interested in graduation rates because what we know is the longer it takes a student to get through a program, the less likely they're going to complete. Life gets in the way. That's one. Two, if a school participates in student federal financial aid, the longer it takes for them to get through the program, the more likely they are going to run into educational debt, and that also impacts their ability to complete and pursue the degree and their purpose. So your placement rates at the top, you'll notice in 2022, the overall placement rate was around 80%, a little higher in the MDiv, a little lower in the MA. ATS schools tend to do really well in placement. Part of that's driven by the fact that it's not uncommon for folks to already be in ministry and then come to seminary and then go back to where they were or something similar. So I just want you to know that placement rates at 80% relative to your peer set, however you want to do it, is a little lower. I just want to note that. I think that's something that I would like for you all to be aware of and pay attention to. The second thing I want you to do is look at the graduation rates. And the way that ATS calculates it is to say, okay, well, the MDiv is on average a 3-year degree. Let's look at 2 times that. So we'll go back 6 years. What percent of those students have actually graduated within 6 years? Okay. And your rates are lower than your peer set. That's also an acknowledgement. One, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is an indication that your students are more part-time, right? But what we also want to do is make sure that we understand, is this occurring because of attrition, right? Are we having a retention issue? And that's something that I think would be important for you all to kind of think about. Our interest here is to have a conversation about the wholeness of the student. So the student decides to come participate in your degree program because it will help them fulfill God's mission in God's world, help them fulfill their calling in that space. And so we want to pay attention to placements and graduation rates. Okay. All right. So let me then just come to one kind of final piece that, Dennis, thank you for letting me move through that pretty quickly. Let me just acknowledge too that if you have any questions, please make sure they get to Dennis, or you can contact me directly. If there's other data that you might be interested in, I think that's really my interest here is to kind of pique your interest in terms of data, but also to make sure that you're thinking about the ecosystem in which you're doing your work. and how that ecosystem is both helping and perhaps not helping. So the final section then is talking about possibilities. So in light of our assessment of the times, right, based upon what we just saw, is that based upon a blizzard, a winter, an ice age, where are we? What does that look like? Based upon a true understanding of the ecosystem, using some of this data, now our section is talking about the possibilities. What does it look like? How do we pursue what I'm calling our core why? And how do we make a strategic assessment of what matters? I want you to do that based upon what you know, so that you can say, where have we been, as we try to assess where we need to go. And this core why concept comes out of a book, Simon Sinek. It's called Start With Why. It's been pretty instructive for me. I've got, he also does a TED Talk on this. And the instructive part for me, there's lots of good stuff in there, but Sinek talks about the golden circle. This has been something that's been instructive with my work with ATS schools. So to use his words, you can see there what every organization on the planet can say what they do, right? We can talk about what we do, the products we sell, the services we provide. Goes even further, and he says, actually, you know, many schools can say how they do it. In this case, it's what makes them special, what sets them apart, what makes them unique from others, okay? But what Sinek says, and what I've been trying to kind of push schools to think about is, you know, we've got the what, we've got the how, but what really matters is the why. It's the why that will actually make a difference. And as I kind of unpack this a little bit, I think as ATS institutions, we spend so much of our conversation on the how and the what, and forget to have conversations about the why. And let me talk about that a little bit. So why is the very reason that the organization exists? It's the purpose, it's the cause, it's the belief. It's what I actually call the core why, the core purpose. And when we look at ATS schools, it's not uncommon for ATS schools to say, like, if I actually, and again, if we had a little bit more time and I was in that space, I would say, so what is it that you do? What do you do as North Park? It's most mission statements of ATS schools would be something along the lines of preparing or educating students, preparing or educating leaders. That's kind of where we spend our time, and our mission statements are really kind of around what we actually do, but it's the what, right? We go a little bit further, ATS schools will say, okay, hang on a second. Well, what we do is we actually do that by offering unique programs taught by respected faculty in a variety of modalities. As they start to try to differentiate themselves, they talk about unique programs, respected faculty, a variety of modalities. And actually, if you press into that just a little bit, what you'll find is there are not many unique programs. ATS has about 280 members. There are about 245 MA degrees that are actually offered. Right, we've gone all over the place, and if you looked at many of them, they would not be that different. So the degrees, MDivs, MAs, where we're trying to do some differentiation, they're really not that unique. And in fact, because there are some faculty in the room, I could say this: most ATS schools would say we have a world-class faculty. That's a very common refrain. In fact, I believe it. But if in fact every ATS school has a world-class faculty, guess what? That's not a differentiator, right? It doesn't differentiate you from other ATS schools. And modalities, right? We talk a lot about different modalities. Well, we do this, or we do this, or we, you know, hybrid, where we have these cohort models. We have, like, our modalities, friends, are not that different. So sometimes ATS schools claim a uniqueness that frankly is not that unique. And what I really want you to kind of press in on is, what is our core why? What actually makes us who we are? Because I think if you really think about it, if I'm using this concept of the core why, and you look at the red there, you know, theological schools, the way in which we're structured, we're governed, we do our academics, we do our business model, all of that's the how and the what. We spend all of our time wrestling with the how and the what, and we oftentimes forget to have the conversations about the why. Why do we exist? What is our core purpose? And then from that, we start kind of pulling back from there to say, okay, if this is in fact our why, then can we rethink how we do things? Can we rethink what we do? Because sometimes our approaches don't take into, are too incremental in our thinking, right? We go back to the assessing the times. Sometimes we're thinking too incrementally because we're stuck around the how and the what. And if we start thinking about the why, it opens up the conditions of possibility of being more thoughtful and innovative in terms of what is the mission and the core purpose that God is calling us to, and what is the core purpose that God is calling us from. Okay. All right. So let me just pause there, and Cheryl's raised her hand.
Thanks, Chris. I'm wondering, I'm taking to heart and trying to engage the thought of, we're not as unique as we think we are, kind of thing.
You heard it.
Yeah, I did hear that. I'm listening. So there's these two things that I'm kind of wrestling with that thought. One is, as a school with a distinctive, not just of being Christian and city-centered, but also intercultural, does who become an important question in this as well? Like when we think about who, we're serving, who we're learning with. And to this end, we have recently a North Park University alum who's come back and wanted to teach with us at the seminary, who has taught at Yale, who has taught at University of Chicago, who has taught at Northwestern. Why does he say he doesn't want to teach at any of these places and come back to North Park Seminary to teach? It was our who. He said, you have a prison education program that is including folks who are incarcerated in an inside-outside classroom. And he's more compelled by that model of adaptation than other models. And so I guess I'm just trying to think about, is that another helpful question for us in that Simon Sinek model?
So certainly, what I will appreciate the fact that Sinek's model is how, what, and why, right? So what I would want to ask, if we had more time to develop this, right? And so I'm doing this with schools over a 2-day period, would be, how do we understand that moment as part of our core why? Like, what is the real uniqueness that makes that relevant in the conversation, right? Because let me use a different example, okay? Many schools will talk about their purpose. They want to be nimble, agile, affordable. These are really important kind of buzzwords. And yet, when they get to the conversation about the how and the what, often their processes, their procedures, the way in which they operate don't match their core why, okay? So if you discern what your core why is, and you just started to articulate that a bit, and you did that together as a community, right? Then what I want you to do is acknowledge or understand, then you're getting closer to a corporate core why, because if you don't have that corporate core why, there are often 10 to 15 different operative core whys within an institution, right? So in your example, the who would be something I would want to wrestle with in terms of how do we get there in terms of our core purpose or our core why, okay? And then how does our how and what support that? Okay. Other good questions?
I don't know if it's good or not, but could you just distinguish between values and why? Because sometimes values could be what, but it also could be driving the why.
Yeah. So, Paul, what I would like to do in this exercise, right, would be to work through, I would encourage you all to work through that, right? Because, the values might have deeper impact on the institution than the mission statement. We understand that there are both written values and unwritten values. Like how do those play out in our community, right? Because what I'm looking for, what I'm trying to encourage here is what's the community's core why? So that we can drive toward then how do we best make decisions related to how and what that supports that core why? So if it's values, if it's who, that's how I would want to go through that's how I would want you all to go through the processes. How do you actually get to the part where you define the core why? Because what I don't want to do in the exercise very often, like, oh, well, yeah, we have a core why, it's our mission statement. That's not always the case, friends, that the mission statement, in fact, reflects our core purpose, our core values, and all of that. So again, good question. I would love for you as a community or find a space to kind of wrestle through that a bit. What does that look like? So much of our time and energy is spent around the how and the what. Budgets are a how and a what. But budgets can so impact and influence what we're actually doing, both in a good way, but in a not so good way. As an example, people, the way that we're structured, the way that we continue to carry decisions forward, often goes against our ability to think about how are we actually serving our core why. So good questions. I'm so grateful that you all have let me move through this very quickly, right? My intention, thank you, Dennis, again, for allowing me to come into this space. My intention was just to kind of get you to think about, okay, is there a different way to assess the times? Do we understand our ecosystem sufficiently? What would it mean if we actually would rethink it, kind of thinking about our core purpose and our core why? I actually think it gets us to this photo. I was born and grew up in Pittsburgh, but most recently moved to Colorado. And so on one of my walks, I actually happened upon this tree. Friends, how does this even happen? I don't understand how this happened. Well, somebody recently said, let me know that it's very possible that that there were indigenous folks who worked on this tree so it would give them some direction. From my perspective, here's where I think that we are in terms of theological education. I believe the mission still is God's mission in God's world. The tree is still heading up, but I wonder if there aren't places and moments in time where we need to take a redirection. We need to think about what are we doing and are we currently serving the purpose in the way that we need to? And that there might be a place and a time, and I don't know if this is true for North Park, but I am telling you, friends, that this is true for theological education in North America. That we have to rethink and reshape our perspective in terms of what is God doing in the world and how can we participate in it. And that's what I think, like, I like to leave, excuse me, I'd like to leave you with this kind of vision that I think the mission itself hasn't changed, but perhaps our direction might. And that's my encouragement to you.
Well,
So thank you, Dennis. Thank you so much for
Chris,
letting me participate.
thank you. I know we only had an
Yeah.
hour. I'm wondering if we could just thank Chris right now. And Chris, I'll let you sign off, and if everybody else could just stay for a minute. Thanks. Thank you. Mhm.
Appreciate it. Thank you very much. Learned so much from it.
Thank you. Well, thank you all for logging on. Chris has done this workshop before, and he did the data was aggregated, but then he was able to do some things just for us. And I thought it would be good for him to share that with all of you, are such key stakeholders in this. I'm hoping that we can pick up the conversations in some configurations of us, whether it's senior team or the seminary committee, faculty, staff here, to talk about that core why and also the ecosystem that we're part of. I think that's going to help us as we think about the future. I know you might have a bunch of questions. I think if you have like one or two right now, that'd be fine. And then as you think about some things, feel free to send me stuff. And if I need to work with Chris again, I will. But anybody have any quick reaction or comment that you'd like to make now? Well, thank you guys for engaging. I mean, you asked good questions. And Chris, I mean, honestly, he does this in like 90 minutes or 2 hours, and he did an hour. So it was, and we had a little confusion on the time zone because he was in a different time zone. So he said, "Oh, I only have an hour." So, but he did it. He made it happen. So thank you for your good questions as well. All right.
I would make one small comment that while I had a feeling that the MDiv enrollment was declining steadily, the numbers are more drastic than I expected.
Yeah, I think it was good for us all to see that and to feel it a little bit, because that's and also well, I mean, there's a bunch of things to process, but even also how I'm not sure we lose students along the way, even though it takes them a long time to finish, but that those kinds of realities were enlightening as well. The tail end, once we get them in, what's happening on the other side. So there are a few things for us to think about and ponder. I also like the fact that people are, the median application is one school. I mean, people are pretty much know what they want to do and go that. So that decision is made somewhere back there, and we have to figure out when they're, how they're making that decision to apply to one school. Um, okay, Paul, you said value-driven organization that really live in their values. Yes, I'm like that too. That was my work at several churches I served, is that there's the unwritten values and then there's the written ones, and people don't live into what they've written down. All right, well, thank you all again. I won't take up your whole afternoon, but if you have any follow-up questions or concerns, please send them to me. But I just want to say thank you so much for making this a priority and for joining us here at the seminary and trying to discern the times and move forward. It was really helpful. All right, well, blessings to you all. Thank you.
Thank you.